Happy Halloween, everyone! So I hope you like my little Halloween display. This is all the stuff that I managed to pick up for Halloween this year, and including some little projects that I put together. So I'm going to show you how I did these projects. I've got a little tombstone, some sparkly pumpkins, and a cool little angel sitting in her little angel coffin. Okay, so the first one is creating the pumpkins. Now, I bought these on eBay, these pumpkins. They're styrofoam pumpkins. They are a little bit squished, which was a bit of a pain, but they were really cheap. I believe I spent $10 including shipping to get all 6 of these pumpkins. Now, of course, the first things first is to mix some paint, and I'm using this orange paint that I've mixed, as you saw, putting the yellow and the red and mixing a nice bright orange pumpkin colour. Now, once I do the first coat, I wanted to then go in with some shading. So I've used a red and a yellow, and the red I'm putting into the grooves of the pumpkin because they're the areas that would be a little bit darker naturally. And then on the other parts, I use a bit of yellow to shade those out. So the sort of bulgy parts, if you like, I'm doing in a yellowy orange. And it's best to do all of this while it's wet, so both the red and the yellow, just keep working with both while they're wet because you can then blend them a lot easier. Now, this is just acrylic paint. You can use any student quality acrylic paint, is fine. You may need a couple of coats for it because, well, these ones in particular are a white pumpkin, so it did take a couple of coats to get it really covered. So you can see the difference with the ones that I've shaded there. It just gives it a bit more dimension. And you could even go in there with an even darker colour, a darker red, putting a bit of black in there or something. Now, I just decided to keep mine simple and add some glitter to them as well. You could, if you wanted, to paint scary faces on them or anything Halloween related. You could do different colours. But yeah, I stayed quite traditional. I used a coppery coloured glitter. I think if I was doing it again, I'd probably go for a lighter coloured glitter because I thought once I put this on, I realised it was a little bit dark. But once it dried, it actually looked pretty good. And there's my glittery pumpkins. Okay, so now I bought this tombstone from Right Art and Craft. It's just a really simple wooden tombstone with a base on it. I showed you earlier the mica flakes I was holding up. I used those to get a bit of texture on the tombstone because I wanted it to look a bit more like stone. Now, I didn't know what else to use to get some texture, but I remembered I had this MUROBOND paint. It's a 3-step system to paint on like a rust finish onto things, and it's got these iron filings in it which give it again a texture that's almost like stone. You could, instead of this, use sand with like PVA and then paint that, or there's different paints that you can get from Bunnings or any sort of hardware store that have the sort of like a render paint that has texture to it already. You could use something like that, is an option as well. Now, I have this mould which has an ornate cross on it, and I've used some polymer clay to press into the mould so that I can later attach this cross to my tombstone. And I just roll it up and press it with my fingers in, and you need to be very careful when you're pulling it out of the mould because it could break, so you just slowly pull each part out until you can easily take the whole thing out. and then bake it in the oven for about 10 minutes usually on 150 Celsius, or just read the packet for the instructions. Now I did need another coat of the MUROBOND. Again, it's a 3-step system, so this next coat is the second step, and this actually makes it rust. I didn't really want it to look like a bit of iron, so I didn't leave this on too long, but I was curious about what finish I could give to it. And it did make it a really cool mottled look, which again I thought looked more like stone. You could instead just use some grey paint to get that sort of look to your tombstone. Now, I use a lot of silk and wool in my jewellery, so I have things like this silk, it's called Silk Throster's Waist, and it's just very textured off cuts or off bits of silk fibres that you can get. But you could use actual moss, and you can see I'm using obviously lots of different green colours here to get that mossy look. And then I've got these little wool nibs, they're called. They're just again a textural thing that you can use in felt work. But you know, again, you could use a coloured material, or you could actually go into the garden and find some bits and pieces that you could glue on here just to make it look like it's a tombstone in the ground. I also decided to put some up on the top of the tombstone there, just to make it look like moss is starting to grow on different parts of the tombstone. To make it look more natural, I've used different coloured greens, because in nature things don't look perfect, so there is usually different colours that shade into one another, and doing this makes it look a bit more like something from nature. I then used my little hot glue gun, and I've got these 2 little red roses that I thought would look cool at the bottom. And the rest of it I did off camera, which you will have seen in the little display. So for my angel coffin, I have this larger cross mould that I wanted to use, exactly like the smaller one I used previously, except bigger. And you'll see the size of the coffin in a minute, why I used this bigger mould. If you don't have a mould, you could use an old piece of necklace that maybe has a cross on it. You could paint a cross on there, or you know, use different beads or anything really that you want to decorate your coffin with. So again, I had to bake that in the oven, and then it was ready for me to glue on. And I wanted to make sure it was right in the center, you know, where you would expect the cross to sit. So I did a line between the widest part of the coffin and then across the whole length of the coffin to get the placement right. Again, I'm just using hot glue. Now, I picked up this coffin from Right Art and Craft, which is in Australia, but all sorts of different craft areas and online craft stores sell things like this that you can use. So I've got a bit of a stash of old jewellery. Now, you can find this sort of stuff at secondhand stores. I had a friend that gave me a whole stash of jewellery that they had, which was really cool for craft things. And I've used it in so many different projects. And I found those wings, which I thought was perfect because I have a skeleton to put in this that has wings on it as well. So I thought it was great that I could put these little wings on the coffin. Now again, if you don't have old jewellery, you could just use different rhinestones that you can get from craft stores. You could use beads. You could really use anything you like. Just use your creativity and have a look around at some things that you can repurpose. So I really wanted this to be very ornate, and that's why I've put all different crystals and things on this one. After that, I wanted to edge this because I thought it would look really cool if it had a really nice patterned edge around the top of it there. And I had this trim that I had in my stash, and I've just hot glued this onto the edge. I didn't cut it or anything, I've just really bent it at the corners and glued it down with the hot glue. And I would do this a section at a time just because you need to press it on while it's nice and hot. I also have this stash of gold coloured rhinestones that I got from Spotlight. Spotlight is a shop in Australia that has craft bits and pieces. Again, if you are not in Australia, I would just have a look around for different rhinestones. But you can use a nice edge of rhinestones. I think looks really cool on this project. And I just tried to evenly space them out. I actually didn't measure it or anything. I wasn't too worried about being super precise. I just sort of did it by eye. But if you wanted to be really careful and really precise, then just use your ruler and then make little marks of even spacing so that you get your little crystals where you want them. Then I went ahead and painted the whole thing with a black enamel paint. I had this already from a different project and from painting some furniture, so I just used that. You could really use any sort of black acrylic paint would be fine. This is just, I had this on hand, so I used that. I really wanted to get the paint into the crevices of the crystals, but then still have the colour of them show through. So you can see I've got an old dishcloth there, and I'm just wiping back the paint on the top of the crystals so that you can see some of the colour of the crystals peeking through. Doing this gives it a really antiqued look when you're done, so that's why I wanted to do it this way and glue everything on first. wasn't too worried about being absolutely perfect with the crystals and wiping all the paint off, because again, I just felt like it added to it looking, you know, really antiqued and old. If you did want all of the crystals to be pristine, then I'd probably recommend painting it first instead and then gluing everything on afterwards. Just depends what you want it to look like. So again, I wanted to paint everything black, and I used the same paint inside as well, making sure to cover every part of the wood. Once that dried, I wanted to do a lining on this as well. Now, I would have used a velvet or something if I had something on hand, but I didn't. So I decided to use this mesh material I had instead, sort of an organza material that I have on hand. I've used this before for my fairy wings project, so if you've watched that video, it's exactly the same as that. I got this from eBay as well, and I believe it was about $20 for quite a long roll of organza. So I used the same sort of technique that I did for my fairy wings, in that I can glue on the top of the organza and it sort of seeps through enough to stick it onto what's underneath, which made it a little bit easier than trying to glue and then press the material on top of it, because it's quite hard to get the placement of the organza, you know, accurate. So I thought that was an easier way to do it. If you were using PVA, you could potentially paint that inside and press the material onto it that way, but I just decided to do it this way. Now again, I've got this trim that I decided to use around the edge to give it a nice finish. Now I did get this trim a really long time ago. It was from a market, I believe, and I got it really cheap, but you can get this sort of stuff everywhere. If again you checked eBay or a craft stall or what have you, and you can really use any trim here that you want. It's just up to you. You know, you can make it any colour, any finish, but it just gives it a nice finishing touch. You can see I also put some applique, the gold applique at the bottom, and that was just for a bit of interest and to cover up some of the hot glue that I had down there as well. And then I edged it with, again, the same gold little jewels from a pack that I got from Spotlight. So I got a big mixed pack of those gold rhinestones, and they had all different shapes in them, and so I liked the little circle ones because it just looked like what you'd see you know, on a actual coffin, sort of studs on the design. So I thought that would look really cool in there as well. And then I did pretty much the same thing for the top. So you can see I used the same organza, the same trim. I did an edge around the lip of the top and then an edge at the bottom as well, and I just like the look of that. Got to be really careful with the hot glue. It can be a little bit tricky, and I'd again recommend you do a bit by bit because it does need to be nice and hot for it to stick on well. So you can see I had a bit of excess organza sticking out the edge there, and it's much easier to have too much and then trim it off, because if you don't have enough, then you know it will look a bit messy and you may have gaps and things of the organza. And then I've just used the same rhinestones again around the edge, just like I did on the bottom. Now I wanted to then go over the top of some of this to make it look a bit more aged, and I was just trying to add a bit more gold in here. So I have this wax that's a gold antiquing wax, and I'm just using my finger to rub this over the edges and the lace and everything to make it all look a bit more gold. You can use any wax you like for this, or if you don't have wax, I'd probably recommend using a dry brush method, which means just using a really rough, large brush that's really thick bristles, and using just a tiny bit of paint and then lightly brushing that over the top of the areas that you're wanting to accentuate so that it doesn't go into the crevices. So you want to use the tiniest bit of paint and then really almost flick it over the top of what you're doing. Otherwise the wax is great and you just rub this into all the areas that you want to accentuate. I used very minimal amounts at a time on my hands for the wax, because otherwise you don't get that really aged look. It would just go entirely gold. But you can see I've got that really nice shaded look on the coffin. And here's my little display. So you can see I've got my little angel that sits in the angel coffin. And then I've got my pumpkins that I made with the glitter. And I had a few other bits and pieces that I put together with this as well. You can see my tombstone there. I added on the cross and some other details after the part that I showed you guys. I hope you've enjoyed this. A little bit of Halloween inspiration for you maybe. If you like my videos, make sure you do hit subscribe so you can see what's happening in Faewood. And for the rest of you, I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.